What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Philosophical Friday. This is your co-hosts, Peter Birmingham and yours truly, Duncan Palamordes. Peter, how are you today and why are we excited?
I am very well, Duncan, and we are very excited. We have a very special guest today. I don't think he really needs much of an introduction to most of our audience. He's a poker player, writer, philosopher, all those things. And one of the hosts of the Thinking Poker podcast, and that is Mr. Andrew Brokos. You're very welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate the opportunity to join you. I was saying right before we started recording, I have very fond memories of I think our longest interview ever on the Thinking Poker podcast was with Duncan. We just kept going and going. So I remember that being a very fun conversation. And if he sees fit to work with you, Peter, then I'm sure that we'll get on as well.
Oh, thank you.
we appreciate the kind words. And Andrew, I know you need no introduction in the poker world, but we will give you a proper one regardless, because I'm so excited. So to attempt the impossible and summarize, Andrew in a few words, the phrase asset to the poker community comes to mind. He's an author of over a dozen books that I know of, including the highly acclaimed Play Optimal Poker series, as well the most recent Essential Poker Concept series, which you can find on Amazon, but in other places as well, and his website. He's also the author of an article that sits on my personal Hall of Fame of best articles of all time. It's the 2009 article, Raising for Information. He hosts one of the oldest and longest podcasts in poker's history, Thinking Poker, who has piloted both by himself, but also with incredible co-hosts such as Nate Mavis in the past and currently Carlos Welch. He's, of course, a top poker player with several cashes at WSOP. He's also an instructor, and he has helped several people improve their games, including myself, both directly and indirectly. So I owe a lot of my present game to Andrew and all the things that I've learned from him over the years, over the more than a decade now. So in terms of background, he's formally trained in philosophy with a degree from University of Chicago, which gives us the perfect excuse to invite him over to podcast and have a conversation with him. Andrew, what I want to know, did I forget anything? I'm pretty sure I did.
Well, what life can be summarized in just a few sentences. I want to quibble a little bit with the formally trained in philosophy, just so people don't get too excited. I do have a degree in philosophy. That degree is 20 years old, and we can talk about how little was required of me to receive a philosophy degree from the University of Chicago. It might appall people who have certain ideas about philosophy, but I will say there are significant blind spots in my knowledge of the philosophical canon.
So I guess then one question would be, if you compare the things that you learn during your training and after your training, because I'm sure you do your own reading and things like that, how would the two compare? What are the things that perhaps you learned over the past 20 years versus during your training?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I would think about having been trained in philosophy, like taking philosophy classes and things, is not so much that I learned like specific information, that I'm gonna like repeat a sentence or something that was, oh, this professor said this, and it just blew my mind. I mean, there were probably a few moments like that, but I think a lot more of it is just getting tools for the rest of your life that kind of help you to make the kinds of decisions that we all have to face, and hopefully continue to accumulate wisdom and learn more about the world. So I think there's no question that 20 years of life experience, you're going to learn a lot more than you are no matter how rich the like academic setting that you're in. But I think that with a good foundation, and it's not like philosophy is the only way that you can get this foundation, but I think that it helps you to make the most of the experience. I mean, to process experiences that you've already had and things that you've already read, and then also to make the most of experiences that you will have going forward. I think actually, to the extent that I would say like the University of Chicago in particular is really aggressive on like not being practical. That's like their whole thing is like, we don't offer any like practical job training skills. Like unless the job that you have in mind is academic, like there's no pre-law, there's no pre-med, like that's not there's no practical training of any kind. But so like one of the more practical things, I took a course on happiness, which I mostly just took because I liked the professor, but it did actually end up being, it was surprisingly rigorous first. Some people kind of thought it was my senior year, and some people were like, oh, that's like a slacker class that you're taking in your senior year. But there was a good amount of rigor. Like there was a lot of reading involved, and I mean, we were to some degree looking also at the sociology of happiness, not just the kind of vague, what makes people happy, but just questions about like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does that look like? But just very practically, like what actually makes people happy? And I'd heard these things before, but the idea of there is a level of wealth that is important, right? That like essentially the main driver of happiness for a lot of people is feeling control over your life. So when you're in a state of poverty where you don't have control over your life, right? You don't know where your next meal is coming from, or you're not protected from the elements or from dangerous people in your life or whatever. That is very stressful, and that leads to people experiencing low levels of happiness or high levels of unhappiness. And but once you've kind of secured certain things, like if you have, for instance, and I'm sure we've all heard this, right? Like you have $1 million and then you get another million, like you are not doubling your happiness.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So and I think that has a lot of implications for poker in terms of what your goals are in poker, and what opportunities you pursue and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, the so-called diminishing utility of wealth, right? You're absolutely correct. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was hoping to ask you as a joke, what is the meaning of life? And now that you made that amazing introduction, I'm going to ask you very seriously, what is the meaning of life for you, Andrew? Like, what would you say it is?
I know I claimed earlier to have learned a lot in the last 20 years. I can't claim that I've learned the answer to that question.
What would you say is your current working theory? Like if you were to you wake up today and you had to decide for yourself, this is where I think the answer is so far for me, what would the answer be?
I mean, it's just on like a practical, like day-to-day basis. I would say the main thing I'm trying to do is like treat people well, and in particular to look out for people who are often not treated well, to sort of take particular interest in people who are not treated well, and to try to take advantage of the position that I'm in, like various privileges that I have in my life, and just the platform that I have, and the microphone that I have to improve their treatment, or help other people understand the plight of people who are often not treated well.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And what, if I were to follow up on this, what is it that makes you, happy or content? What happens? What are the inner workings? The reason behind that? What would you say is the reason why it gives you pleasure?
I think it's often hearing from someone that their life was improved or enriched as a result of something that I did. And that so the other big thing that I've done outside of poker is I was very active in competitive debate when I was in high school and college, and then later worked in the Chicago public schools, and then in the Boston public schools, starting debate or facilitating debate programs in high schools, and now this organization is working in the middle schools as well in Boston. And that was something that I was very involved with for a few years. And so now the people who I knew as kids when they were in that program are now entering their 30s, and are starting to have established careers of their own and things like that. So there's a satisfaction in I always kind of thought of that as like, well, that's the more like meaningful side of my life. There's like the poker is kind of utilitarian, mercenary. I have to make some money over there, and then like the meaningful thing that I'm doing is helping these kids. And I won't claim that like poker is equally as enriching, but I mean, I have thought, especially as I've started spending more and more of my time in the poker space, not just playing poker, but as you mentioned, like writing the books and doing the podcast and that sort of thing. I did kind of wonder, like, well, is that enough? Like, have I am I getting too distracted by that, and I'm not as focused on those things that I told you were important to me a moment ago? Like, am I actualizing that in the work that I'm doing? And so we have occasionally gotten comments from people, particularly like during the height of the pandemic, where people were saying that like the podcast was actually a thing that was helpful to them, that it was reassuring for them to be able to listen to it, or just, people had jobs that they really didn't like, and being able to listen to the podcast while they were doing that job. I think that I probably am, or have, I still do it, I guess, sold short a little bit the value of just creating something, even if it's not as kind of explicitly helpful as teaching like valuable life skills to underprivileged youth or something.
Sure.
I think that a lot of people are unhappy in different ways, and there's a lot of ways that you can lift them up, and they don't all have to be and it's not like, I mean, so like I don't really think of any of this as charitable. Like, I enjoyed the debate stuff a lot. I made a lot of friends that enriched my life in a lot of ways, and certainly the podcast is like, Carlos and I enjoy doing that together. We don't make a lot of money from it. It's just like, it's a thing that we enjoy doing, and part of that joy comes from the fact that that's a joy that the audience shares, and knowing that is that other people are also enjoying that.
No, that makes perfect sense, and we can totally relate to that. And to your point, I understand. Sometimes poker can get a bad rep, but at the same time, it is a leisure activity. It is games can be important to many people. Knowing to how to navigate. We've talked in this podcast a lot about the concept of flow from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which, I mean, this book now is, I don't know, 40 years old.
Yeah, but I encountered that book for the first time in that happiness class.
And the happiness class, I see. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting, but it is very cool because poker, in some sense, has all of these attributes for somebody to go into flow. I mean, it has a feedback mechanism. It's a little bit of a twisted feedback mechanism, but there is some goal setting, and it challenges you. So I can see why people can improve their lives by potentially getting better at it. So you're right. I mean, it's not exactly like teaching underprivileged kids, but at the same time, it can have tremendous amount of value, especially, again, as someone on the receiving end, especially the way you're doing it, was what I was about to say. Like, as someone who's been following your work for a long time, it has helped me tremendously improve my life. I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure a lot of other people can relate to that. So there is a great deal that can be said even for that game, especially when it's done in sort of like a proper way. We treat everybody with respect. It's a competitive game. We understand that all we sit at the poker table. We're there and we're taking certain risks. As long as all of these things are clearly defined, nobody is struggling with addictions and we're taking advantage of them, and all of this side ugly stuff that can be there. As long as we have a proper way to not necessarily eliminate them but mitigate them, I think they can be very beneficial.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm very influenced on this by Tommy Angelo, who I don't want to like butcher the line, but to paraphrase him a little bit, I think essentially he says, poker is like a machine for producing misery, maybe is the word that he uses. That it is sort of perfectly calibrated. Of you're at least when you're playing live poker, you're in public, you're experiencing, maybe pain was the word he used. He's big on that word pain, but your other people are seeing you experience this pain. There's money involved. there's inconsistent feedback, just like all these things. But so you can take that as a positive though, and you can say, well, this is a kind of, in some sense, low stakes. Even if you're playing for a lot of money, it's low stakes compared to like many things that will actually happen in your life, dealing, the death of loved ones or illness or various, so it is kind of a low stakes or practice environment to experience those things and learn to deal with disappointments and learn to deal with other people getting very upset around you. Like, that's a huge thing that I learned from poker, is just, a lot of times people will get very angry in some sense at you. They'll call you names, or they'll say nasty things to you, and to be able to separate yourself from that a lot, and say, like, because in poker it's so obvious. You're like, okay, that guy's mad because he paid off a river bet that he knew he shouldn't have, and now somehow that's my fault. Like, see, this, like, it's very clear to see the connection. But then you start to see that elsewhere in your life. You're like, oh, I see, this person is actually upset about something entirely different, even though they're shouting at me right now. It's still not easy, but like, it's a little easier for me to be compassionate in my response when people are behaving aggressively toward toward me to have had those experiences in poker, and oh, I recognize this behavior. I see what this is.
No, this is absolutely Peter.
Oh, sorry, Duncan, didn't mean to. It just it brings up actually just talking about the sort of that social side of it, brings up something interesting, because Patrick Howard actually tweeted yesterday about how expensive of a hobby is online poker for a recreational player. And actually, surprisingly, and obviously we know Patrick is big into MDA and obviously has huge pools, so we can kind of take it that his information is relatively is relatively good. That it's about $18 an hour for a recreational to play 100 no limit online, which, if that's something you're enjoying and you get pleasure from, even if you're losing, it's not actually an expensive hobby from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
like 18, there's not much you can do for $18 an hour that would give you a lot of entertainment, you know, probably that level of interaction and entertainment, where like you can still win, but at the end of the day, it's, you know, you're placing bets and overall you're losing, but there is a potential there. So yeah, it's just an interesting sort of sidetrack on it there.
Yeah.
Andrew, did you want to comment on that? You had something to say on that?
I think what I was going to say, the other thing I was going to say in terms of seeing behavior, it was a non-poker example actually, but I spent some time a couple of years ago with my cousin and her daughter, who at the time was maybe about 3 years old, and I got on very well. I still have a very good relationship with I guess she's my second cousin or my first cousin once removed, however that works. But you know, she was my partner and I were staying at their house for a few weeks, and so you know we were in a pretty like intense relationship with the two of them during the time that we were there. You know, we were almost like co-parenting the kid. Her husband was away, so it was helpful to like have some other people there. But so you know, this little girl was very sweet with me most of the time, and then you could just tell like when she got tired, she was turned into a monster. And like there was one time we were building blocks together, and all of a sudden she just like walked over out of nowhere and pulled my hair and called me Andrew Poopyhead. And I was like, well, I just got bullied by a 3-year-old, so that was kind of funny. But like it was just it was so plain to see, you know, how much her mood changed once she was tired. And then I started to realize, like, I started to see that in myself, you know, where I was like, so much of my being impatient with people or upset or even just like kind of pessimistic about anything, you know, just
right.
I'm just like, so much of it is fixed by sleeping or eating or getting a drink of water, just like very basic physical needs. I mean, maybe some people, this is a level of emotional awareness that they learn much younger in life, but like I had to learn it from, you know, seeing a 3-year-old struggle with emotional regulation and then recognizing that behavior in myself.
Absolutely, Andrew. And, you know, let me say this, we can learn from anything and anyone. And it's funny that you mention those things, because there's so much free and good information, I would say, online. Some of it information is actually bad. But one of the things that I recently noticed also is that you can have a lot of different approaches to life and a lot of different suggestions. But very often the common denominator comes down to things that you just mentioned, you know, like get your sunlight, drink your water, get enough sleep, eat properly, whatever that means for you, exercise. And it's funny that you mentioned that, but yes, a 3-year-old absolutely can teach us that. And anybody, it reminds me of my uncle who used to say, I learn from everybody. He talks to random people on the street and then he learns from them. Yes, We did have a question for you, so that, you know, for the, I don't know, less than 1% of the listeners who don't know who you are. So perhaps like a little bit, we can play a little bit of game. So imagine that we have sort of like an alien visiting, right? And you get to choose a game to compete against them. And that game is a elaborate game. It doesn't have to be poker. It can be basically something you think you are on the top percentile of the world, so that you would be a good representative to play against the alien. And let's say it's a thought experiment. So we have a device that accurately measures your skills. So for example, if that game is your ability to tell the truth, we have a device that does that. If you know, the game is let's say intuition, we have a device that accurately measures that. So it's sort of like a black box. And conversely, what would you say is something you believe you're at the bottom 1% of? Take it away.
So I'm struggling a little bit to understand the terms here. So
Please.
when you say a game, what, I mean, do you mean a game like poker, or?
Oh yeah, yeah. So for that, that's a fair question. No, I mean like something, an attribute or a game. Basically, you can compete. What would you say is one of your attributes or a skill that you think you are at the near the top of the world? If you were to measure your skills against everybody in the world, you will say, well, that's probably something that I'm near the top percentile. So I will be a good representative to, to compete on that attribute / game. I'm using the term game metaphorically, against the alien.
Okay, this is going to be a very nitty answer, but
Please.
very few people are in the top 1% of anything in the world.
That's right. That's right.
So
that's very good.
I'm reluctant to put myself in that category, but
Okay.
I guess just in terms of like what attribute would I choose as kind of my most competitive, and I'm going to assume that I don't know anything about these aliens, because my first, I'm tempted to say something like logic.
Logic.
But that I think like is sort of the traditional like science fiction alien, I think, is also like very good at logic. So I don't know if I would necessarily claim to have a relative advantage, but if these are like blank slate aliens, we're not bound by any sort of canon, then yeah, I would probably take logic up there. And I mean, emotional awareness could easily be on the bottom, despite like all the things that I was just sharing with you are like very recent revelations for me. So, yeah, that could be at the bottom.
Logic and emotional awareness, the two extremes. I absolutely.
I didn't even think about that as I was giving the answer, but yes.
Absolutely. And if in the middle of the conversation you think something else, you absolutely let us know. And by the way, I just want to point out for the listener, it's typically a sign of a great mind to understand how difficult it is to be on the top 1%. Typically, people, it's sort of like the reverse Dunning-Kruger, right? I mean, just basically realizing how difficult it is to be on the top 1%, it's probably a hint that there might be a category that you actually are on the top 1%, right? I mean, people who are really...
Humility is probably my top.
I love it. I love it. And actually, Andrew, you mentioned debate, and this is something that your audience knows that you've been doing for a long time. And Peter, I believe you had a question about debate, right? Like
So I was thinking about this one, and I said, what do you ask somebody who's like, a philosopher and a debater? Well, if you were to be stuck on a desert island, Andrew, with one person who you could only debate them, and you only had one topic to debate, who would that person be, and what would the topic be?
Wow. It's interesting. A lot of the like first people, so there's like a very different question from who would you like to meet, right? Because this is like, who do you want to spend a lot of time with? And when I think back over kind of like specific like writers or philosophers or people who have influenced me or whose work I find interesting, I'm not particularly interested in like the biographies of people, but a fair amount of them do seem like pretty antisocial people. Like I think Nietzsche, it would be a lot to be like on an island with Nietzsche.
Oh, yes.
Probably even like David Foster Wallace. Like I think he held it together in certain public settings, but I think that just like being on an island with him would be quite a lot. Yeah, I would just like the combrevealing of kind of interesting but also tolerable.
Yeah, that's
I guess I'm revealing something about myself, that I'm a lot more concerned about the tolerable than the interesting. But that's a big commitment.
To be fair, it's not an insurmountable thing. Like, I mean, it's something you have to consider.
Yeah. So now I'm trying to think like who I mean, I don't know that I'd really want to like debate him. Martin Luther King comes to mind as sort of like a person who's both kind of like very, very wise and influential, but also seems like, would be pleasant to be around and not
interesting. Right.
But yeah, I guess I would rather just like sit and listen to him talk than like argue. I mean, I guess the debater in me would like find something to argue with him about eventually, but yeah, I think the combination of those two things is tricky for me to pinpoint a good candidate.
Absolutely.
That's not unreasonable. It is like, I mean, it's difficult. It's almost like picking your 3 favorite albums to take to Mars with you, which was the discussion we were having just before we came on air. But it's nice to just even get a sense of, you know, what the kind of people that you would find interesting to talk to is good. So thanks for that, Andrew.
Yeah. And how about somebody like Diogenes, like one of the first cynics? Because you mentioned somebody who's interesting, and there's a story that immediately popped to mind. I believe it was Alexander the Great at the time who visited Athens, and Diogenes was like very popular. For those who may not know, he was like walking around on a stick. He was peeing in public. He just didn't care about the social aspects. He wasn't doing it for the sake of doing it. He just thought that that's the way of being liberated, basically. And Alexander the Great was impressed. So he comes at some point. I mean, Diogenes was like sitting on a shadow somewhere, and Alexander the Great is like, Diogenes, it's a pleasure to meet you. You know, name one thing and I will absolutely give it to you. And it's like, can you please move away? You're blocking the sun for me. So that sounds like a cool dude. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good example. And I think poker attracts a lot of people like this, where I have a lot of respect for like weirdos or people who are very willing to just kind of like not be constrained, because I think I am a fairly constrained by like social pressure person. So like I have a lot of respect for people who are more just like willing to not care what people think and just do. But again, like as if I were a person on an island with them, I would want them to care what I think. Like
Sure.
They're not necessarily people that I want to like spend a ton of time with, but I do think they are important. And I think like there's a lot that we can learn from them. And I think they should have the space to do the things that they want to. But I think it's like not a coincidence that a lot of great artists fall in this category of like, in their pursuit to be like creative and original, they also, you know, did a lot of damage to people around them.
That's a very good point. And Peter, I mean, you mentioned something we were talking before the podcast started. I mean, we have to follow up for the listener. What's that? I mean, we can ask that question to Andrew.
Yeah, the 3 albums.
With the three albums yes. You take to Mars, yeah.
Yeah, that's another tricky one where like maybe I'm just too literal with these answers, because a lot of my like if I would just say kind of my favorite albums or something, there's certain things that I know that something is like a good song or is a song that I really liked at one time, but I've just heard it so much that I don't know, like I feel like maybe Hotel California falls in this category where I'm like, it's not a bad song. It's just I've just heard it so many times. I don't need to hear it ever again in my life. Like I'm just good on Hotel California. So there's some stuff like that. I guess in terms of like albums that I actually do return to a lot, and I think that I would like be fairly happy to listen to. There's at least 2 that come to mind right away. The Nirvana Unplugged, that was one of the very first albums that I ever owned, and I still like. I think partly it's just because it was music that I listened to when I was a teenager. It's still kind of, and it's not like, I don't know if it's really like comforting or reassuring music objectively, but it takes me back to, it has like a nice nostalgic effect in addition to, I think, just being a very good album in general. And Neutral Milk Hotel, Aeroplane Over the Sea. That's another, like, it's both nostalgic for me, but I also think just like a very good album. A third choice, I mean, I kind of want to choose like one of the early Kanye West albums, but it's very difficult for me to listen to that now. Like,
yeah,
not in like I don't have like a moral objection to listening to his music. It's not like I can't listen to Kanye West anymore, but like it makes me sad, like, right. Because even like the message of the early albums compared to where he's landed, like some of his early stuff has like a very kind of anti-consumerist message, and I feel like I don't know, I mean, obviously he's going through a lot, but yeah, they are among my favorite albums, but it kind of makes me sad to listen to them now.
No, absolutely. And you know, you're bringing a natural question which is something that people have asked for a long time. Do you think the art can be detached from the artist? And I think you probably know where I'm going with this, but do you think that the piece of art can be enjoyed completely separately from the artist themselves? Or do you think that there's a certain aura of that artist moving around that art, and whatever it may be, something that they've done socially, their previous work, their beliefs about the world, can the two be separated?
I mean, I think there's kind of like, can they be separated for me? Like I know what I know about Kanye West,
Right.
and like I'm going to think of it when I hear his music. So, you know, if I could just sort of play for a person who somehow didn't know who Kanye West was, and I was just like, here, listen to the song, isn't this a good song? Like, of course they could enjoy it, and like it wouldn't be like colored by but like my experience of it is actually I heard I listened to a lot of this podcast WTF, which is one of the like early very popular podcasts hosted by this stand-up comic Mark Maron, and he's had a lot of very famous people on the show now, but initially he had a lot, I mean, he still has a lot of stand-ups on there, but initially it was all like comics that he was friends with. And you know, they talk a lot about the kind of like cancel culture stuff, or and I think talk about it in like a pretty nuanced way that you don't encounter many other places. And one of the things, because he used to have a lot more of an attitude of like, nobody can tell me what to say. I say what I want when I'm on stage. And he was like, you know, ultimately this is like a night out that people are paying for. You know, like they're coming to see you. They, for many people, you know, it's a lot of money to get a babysitter if they have kids, and you know, paying to come to see to the show and things like that. And there's certain topics where if you bring them up, no matter how well crafted your joke is, it's gonna ruin somebody's night. Like if you bring up the concept of sexual assault, you are reminding some people of the worst night of their life, and that's not, or hopefully only one experience of it, but you know, that's just not a pleasant evening out for people. Like they're not getting the thing that they came to get. And I'm not saying like there's no context. Like I think that there are comedians who have, you know, done bits on very touchy subjects and have executed them well. And I think that it works. Like, I think YouTube is nice for this, where like I can seek out that bit when I'm in the mood to see it and I know what I'm getting. I know people like make fun of the idea of like trigger warnings and whatnot now, but you know, I think that springing that on people, and we were just like, you came to see a comedy show and now we're talking about rape. Like that's a lot to just like throw on somebody with no warning. So I don't know how that's maybe a little tangential to your original question, but yeah, it's a sort of, there's connections that you might have to material that like once you know something about who the artist is, whether or not they've inserted anything about it into the material, just like knowing that about, like I think about those things once I hear their music, and then I have to hear it differently.
Oh no, absolutely, and it's an excellent point and a nuanced point. And I mean, I could at least ask you 10 different questions. You know, like like maybe responsibility. You know, that when somebody, for example, goes and listens to somebody like Anthony Jeselnik, and then rape comes up as a topic. Is that as surprising as, let's say, someone like Jerry Seinfeld? So right. Which is like completely different comedians. But you reminded me of a Greek comedian. Unfortunately, the audience may not be familiar with them unless they're Greek themselves. But just to paint a picture, the biggest troll. Imagine the biggest troll in Greece, like literally the biggest troll. He's trolling everybody, and a very funny dude. He is basically the definition of anti-establishment, or the modern Diogenes. And he was asked in an interview, do you think there is limits in comedy? And everybody was expecting this guy to say, no, I can say whatever I want. I mean, I'm trolling everybody on a daily basis. And he said, yes, of course, there's limit in comedy. The audience sets those limits. To your point, Andrew, right? I mean, if somebody goes at the comedy, I mean, they are the customer, right? I mean, they're the people, the comedian is trying to entertain. So if the audience pushes back, that's something that the comedians should and listen to it, and typically will. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think even before, so like once you've brought up the subject, it's too late for them. Like it's more a matter of So I think the answer of like, do you know what you're getting into when you show up? You know, if you are going to an Anthony Jeselnik show, like a fair number of people already know what his deal is, and you know, maybe you should, if you are bringing someone who doesn't know, maybe you should warn them what they're in for. But I think, you know, I think there's a lot of contexts where people just don't. You know, casinos are a great example of this. Like, people get comp tickets for shows, and they just, and probably casinos have more rules for, you know, like they tell people not to bring up certain subjects just for purely economic reasons of like, look, you know, this is an establishment where we're encouraging escapism and we're not going to raise certain subjects. And I imagine that there's, you know, those forms of sort of discouraging certain topics have come up for a long time. But you know, I know at least for a while, Louis C.K., as part of his kind of I don't know, comeback or whatever thing he's trying to do, you know, was making like surprise appearances at shows. So like, people went to a comedy show with no idea that he was going to be one of the performers, and then he comes out and, you know, is maybe even joking about like the specific things that he did. And that's again, like, people didn't consent to that. They didn't have a chance to opt out of it. They didn't sign up for pushing back or for having an argument with, nor are they on an equal platform to have an argument with him. Like, the damage is kind of already done. I don't have a problem with like the existence of him. I personally, like, I was a big Louis C.K. fan. He's another, I mean, much like Kanye West, where like it's difficult for me, especially because his material does deal with like his sort of weird sexual hangups in a lot of ways. Like, it is difficult to listen to that knowing what I now know about him. I do still think, like, I still think a lot, and like a lot of his earlier stuff did like shape how I think about things. I think he's like a very talented person, and I'm glad that, you know, that material exists in the world. But I think people that, you know, deserve to be warned that they are, you know, about to be exposed to Louis C.K. humor and not have it like sprung on them.
That's a very good point. Information is always key. You know, like when you can have information, then that can trigger awareness, and then it can help with the decisions. And
consent, I would say, like, because I think
right.
I was thinking about this. You mentioned, you know, when we were talking about poker a while back, and you know, people often ask this question of kind of like, or people who don't know a lot about poker have the idea that poker is a lot about like lying, or the bluffing is lying. And the way that I think about it is, there's no like, deception is the expectation when you're at the poker. Like, everyone is there fully understanding, or I mean, it gets awkward when they're not. Like, I've played in some settings where it is a more casual thing, and people are like, "Oh, you're playing a little hard, man. Like, we don't check and raise here." Like, you know,
check and raise is permitted.
yeah. So like that, I find that an awkward situation, because I'm like, are we doing this or not? Like, it's fine if we're gonna, like, I don't want to play poker if we're gonna like, if we're just gonna be like, hang, like, I'll play a different game. Like, I don't, but if it's poker, then like it needs to be cutthroat. That's what the game is. Right. So like, but you know, in most poker settings, it's just understood that, you know, we're going to be cutthroat. We're trying to deceive each other, and there's no expectation of truth. Even when you ask me a question like, "What did you have in that hand?" You know that I'm not necessarily, like, you're fully, right. You know, you're going to read into whatever I say, but the expectation is not that I'm telling you the truth when I tell you something, and we both know that, and that's like part of the conversation. And so I think like where deception becomes a problem, or where that kind of like mercenary thinking becomes a problem, is in relationships where that's not consented to. You know, like in a romantic relationship where the at least one person's idea is, you know, we're not just each trying to maximize our own interests and, you know, sort of whatever we take from the other person. We, you know, like, if one person is thinking of it that way and the other one is not, that's a problem. And so I think, you know, like, poker, I think, works because it is an understood environment where everyone has kind of agreed and consented to relate to each other in that way.
Absolutely, to the point we were essentially discussing earlier, that as long as these things are the social contract, if you will, like it's understood what the rules of the game are. Absolutely, yes. And Peter, since we mentioned cancel culture, I believe you had a question on cancel culture. Maybe we can ask him. You know,
it kind of just fed into it that what your opinion was. Obviously, we're in a climate where cancel culture seems, you know, it's kind of taken probably too much of a hold in certain situations. But how much do you think it actually sanitizes debate, where people are now fearful with coming out with, you know, sort of unpopular opinions for fear of cancellation?
I don't know. I don't know if I fully accept the premise that, like, I mean, I know that's a thing that's talked about often. I feel like a lot of the examples that people point to of sort of, here's a person who is canceled, like, it doesn't strike me as anything particularly like egregious or I don't know. I don't feel particularly constrained into, like, in terms of my podcast. Like, I don't go around in fear of, like, oh my God, what if I say the same thing? I certainly am not like, oh, I can't even look at a woman or she's gonna such and such. Like, I feel like a lot of the rhetoric around that is very kind of overblown. I've tried to give people opportunities to convince me on it before, and I'm not really of the opinion that we are in like a particularly cancel culture-y sort of mind. I mean, I'm obviously very aware of like the rhetoric around it. And so your question was like, how much is it chilling debate? I think that what's happening is it's making space for other kinds of arguments that were not previously being heard or being given the kind of footing that they are getting now. And I think it's that kind of there's a good saying around this that I can't think of the exact wording of it. It's sort of like, to a person who has always enjoyed advantages, equality feels like a disadvantage. I think that it is kind of, there are people who are accustomed to having their opinions given a sort of unfair amount of credence, and they were accustomed to other people not being taken seriously or not being heard from at all, that they weren't presented with their ideas at all. And so, I think a lot of what's called cancel culture is actually pushback. It's like no one is actually, like, Louis C.K. is doing fine, he's not canceled. Just one example that is often pointed to as someone who's been like canceled. So I think for a lot of these folks, what's happening is they're getting criticized. And there's more debate, right? There are now people who are debating things that previously were not debated, that previously were just, they were put out there, and there was no pushback was heard from them. So are some of those people now afraid to say things because they can't handle that pushback? Maybe. I feel like that's more on them. I think that you should be willing to defend the things that you're going to say in public. And if you're like, well, I can't say this thing because then people are going to say that I shouldn't have said it, I don't know. I mean, either defend that you should have said it, or maybe they're right and you shouldn't say it. Like, I don't. I'm sure that in the 10 years that I've been podcasting, I'm sure I've said things that I regret. And if someone went back through my 10 year and pulled out something, was like, hey, what about this thing? I would feel comfortable either saying, yeah, that was a mistake. I wouldn't say that now. I'm sorry, but like, and I don't think that I would be canceled as a result of that. I think that as long as that's presented in a genuine way, which it would be from me, I think that would not cause a problem for me. And I think that there might also be things where I would say, yeah, I do still stand by this, and I'll tell you why, and I'll listen to your problems with it, and I'll tell you why I stand by it. And I think a lot of the people who complain about being canceled don't want to do either of those things. They don't want to apologize for something that they said, but they also don't really want to defend the thing that they said. They want to be able to put it out there, but not defend it. And so they often use that phrase, oh, it was just a joke. I said, well, did you mean it or not? Like, okay, I know you said it like it was a punchline, but there was a point there, and it doesn't seem like you want to defend that point, but it also doesn't seem like you want to back off of it. So, like, which is it? Like that kind of waffling. I have, as a debater, I have a big problem with that. Like, I'm fully for. I'll argue basically anything. I'll entertain any argument, but you need to be ready to stand behind it. Like, I'm not going to give it credence in like a sort of half-assed way. Like, I'm going to take it seriously, and that's going to include telling you why you're wrong. If you're wrong.
That's a very interesting point, and I think you're illustrating the idea of responsibility, essentially. Like, you have the responsibility of everything that you're saying. I do have a question related to that. Do you think the element of, I guess, what Taleb would call extremist stand, that we live in an era where we have a little bit too much reach, especially we're talking about successful people. For example, a musician back in the day, they will fill a stadium, and really back in the day, only the people in the village will know about the musician. So if somebody was angry at the musician, you will have the 30 villagers who are angry at them. I mean, certain problems can come from that. They can be ostracized and other things. But in this day and age, if you're successful and, there is let's say a pushback, then you may have like a million people be angry, or sometimes a billion people be angry. And do you think that sort of like extreme power that exists in the modern world should also be taken into account when we measure responsibility?
Sort of the things that you say or put out there might be heard in a totally different context, maybe than really you had no idea. I think this happened with we can easily imagine a hypothetical anyway, where
Sure.
there's a word that means something in a different language,
Right.
and to me it's just like a nonsense word, and so I put it in a song, and
Sure.
and then someone's like, hey, that word means such and such, and they're very upset about it. I don't know. I mean, that strikes me as something where it's sort of like there's an explanation for that, and I understand that some people might not accept that explanation, or are going to be more conspiratorially minded and be like, oh well, he must have known what that meant when he put that out there or something. I mean, I think you're right that as something is exposed to like more and more people, like the likelihood that it's going to bother somebody, or someone is going to have a negative reaction to it, gets higher. I think that is kind of part of just like a social debate. Like it's a big social debate, and like again, it's like more voices are coming into the space, and they have a right to be heard, and other people can kind of evaluate them, and I can decide for myself, like, do I think that person actually knew what that word meant when or like, do I buy the conspiratorial argument, or do I buy the other argument? Like, I think that's just sort of something that gets hashed out. I mean, I agree that we don't have like maybe, so I mean, I think this is like a more general problem of sort of like our certain of our technologies are kind of running ahead of our moral reasoning and some other things as well. I mean, I think there's much bigger places where that's a problem, like our ability to affect people on the other side of the world. Like I think human beings in general are reasonably good at like I mean, the thing that we have experience with anyway is kind of moral reasoning around people who are very close to us, and like physically close to us, but also familial in a family sense close to us. And so thinking like I think a lot of people have a decent intuitive sense of like, oh, it's probably not right to like punch a person who's standing near me, but the harm that we do to people who are more far away from us as a result of our actions, we have the technology now to inflict that harm, and we don't really have moral intuition around how to think about that, how to think about the consequences of our actions for far-flung people, for other forms of life, for people who haven't been born yet. Those are things that we're a lot less good at thinking about. So I think to some extent, like what you're describing there is kind of a subset of that much larger problem.
One example, and this is quite a particular example, but I do think it has like sort of wider ramifications. The issue around J.K. Rowling, is this something you're both familiar with? Why?
Yeah, I would say I'm maybe like at the 70th percentile of knowledge of this, like above average, but not like super knowledgeable.
Just quickly for the listeners, for anyone that doesn't understand, basically she was, in quote unquote terms, cancelled because of her views on transgender people. She is a fierce advocate for women's rights, but she doesn't feel that it is correct for transgender females, I think is the correct term, and if I apologize if I'm wrong, to occupy single sex spaces with cis females, as I think is the correct term, i.e., for example, women's prisons. Now, as a former prison officer, I can completely understand where she's coming from with this, but this has seen her attacked for being transphobic. Now, to me, on a surface level, this would appear an overreaction to call somebody transphobic when they're, on the one hand, protecting one section of society, because this was the point and side she was coming from, that she was protecting the rights of cis females versus allowing transgender females into the same space. There's a lot of competing incentives with this debate. It's not clear cut. And I think to cancel somebody on that sort of basis seems extreme. Like even to the point now where there's a game coming out this week, a Harry Potter game, and this is getting massive blow up that people are not buying it
Hogwarts
because
Legacy,
of what's gone on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I would say is that the existence of that game would suggest that she has not been canceled. Like, again, she is doing fine.
Yeah,
she's being criticized, but she's continuing to publish books. Her material is still being licensed.
But she is being excluded, though, Andrew. She's been excluded. Her legacy has been excluded. Like, there was a massive Harry Potter anniversary show only just Christmas past, and she was completely excluded from that. And that's her legacy. And she's been almost, we don't care who wrote it. It's all about the stars now. That's a big deal to somebody to a writer. Their actual legacy is being pushed to one side.
Yeah, I think this is the details of her situation, I think, are bigger than we're going to be able to sort out in the next couple of minutes.
Absolutely.
I would say that I think there is more to it than your summary there. I think that her presence on Twitter and a lot of things that she's said on Twitter and like other social media spaces, like she may espouse that view that you shared there. I think she's espoused quite a few other views as well. So I think that there's kind of a general there's a context for all of that, and I don't have that full context is part of why
and nor do I. Just as a disclaimer, I don't have the full context either, but
yeah. So I might have lost sight of what the question was beyond my quibbling with the premises.
And if you have concerns for certain situations where people could potentially, and let's say it may not necessarily be J.K. Rowling, but let's say that we have a hypothetical when somebody may have said something which could be reasonable in some respect, but because of the magnifying component of the backlash, the magnifying component of the disagreement, what people would call cancel culture, they actually get ostracized from specific aspects of society.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say there are people. So there are also people who would be ostracized if she were included, right? Like I can fully understand why any trans person would say, well, I don't feel welcome at an event where you're inviting this person who seems to think that I shouldn't exist. And so then it's like, well, someone's going to be excluded one way or the other. And now it's just making a choice about who that person is going to be. And I think traditionally there was no question about that. It was like there were a certain group of people who were always the prioritized ones, and there were other people who were always the marginalized. And like, I mean, that pattern has not like, it's not like that's flipped completely. It's just like, it's moved from being really like rounded to 100 0 to being like 98-2 or something now, you know, like it's still like massively weighted in, I should say, our favor, because I'm largely in the camp of people who do get priority in many of those situations. So I think it's more a question of like whose comfort is prioritized, and like it is like in the past there would be no, I mean, even at the time when those books were written, right, I mean there would be no question as to who was prioritized, and now there is a debate around who's going to be prioritized.
I think that just brings it back around to the idea we were discussing earlier about consent. That if, like, I mean, rather than say, and like, let's take that example where somebody's excluded from, you know, a show about what they've produced, if she can be included, and then if you have objections, you have to consent to watch it. Nobody's been forced to watch this. I think the idea that you're just excluding somebody so that they're not going to watch it anyway. This subset of people are not going to watch a show that's based off the writings of somebody that they don't want anything to do with. So why are we not allowing them to be included when those people who are being discomforted are not going to be taking up the option to watch it anyway? So it comes back to consent, I think. But that's just, you know, this is something I feel quite strongly about, because I have massive objections to the idea of actually canceling anyone who hasn't actually, you know, done something egregious, you know, as in you know, committed a serious crime or whatever. Like, I mean, people are entitled to their thoughts, but I think if you don't want to listen to them, don't listen to them, you know, turn them off, block them, whatever. We don't have to allow these things into our lives. And I think restricting people from going about their business because they have X thoughts is wrong. I'm just
well, but it's someone else's business that you're talking about. I mean, they're making a choice about whether or not to give her a platform within the context of their business, and that it's a choice. And if they choose to prioritize her, then they're going to lose interest from other people, and that's, you know, a choice that they're making.
Yeah. But so they're also choosing to make money off the back of these people as well.
Right. So yeah, in the end of the day, I mean, it is clashes of different responsibilities, right? I mean, different groups have different responsibilities, and different people are expressing different opinions. I guess one question that that is related to all of this, Andrew, is are you concerned at all about, because again, cancel culture is a very complicated issue. Like you said, I mean, the details matter very much. The question is, it is a question: are they really being canceled? Like you raised the point. I mean, the people are generally doing fine, especially very successful people. And when they say things in public, they have the responsibility. So you're making some really good points there. So I guess one question that I'm interested in personally is there an element of frenzy that either in cancel culture or in general that exists out there, or is there like some sort of like a mob mentality that we have to worry about, or this is just simply the result of the technology that we have to live with? So basically, are you worried at all about a potential mob mentality or frenzy as it pertains to the modern world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reluctant to use those terms because I think that they are deliberately used by a certain kind of pundit to try to, like, I think to cast aspersions on an argument, to kind of, there's a mob mentality behind this. So I think it's often used not exactly as a straw man, but it kind of in that same sort of thing, a way of dismissing an argument without actually addressing the merits of that argument. So again, I might have lost sight. The question is, am I concerned about?
Yeah, no, I mean, to be fair, I'm not just saying that there's mob mentality in the J.K. Rowling case.
No, I know you weren't saying that. I just wanted to.
Yeah. No, so
language.
Yeah, basically, and again, I'm not. Maybe I'm misphrasing it, but what I'm basically comes back to the question from earlier, the potential magnifying effect of our technological advances, right? The fact that, you know, one voice can be replicated, the so-called meme mentality, the idea that, you know, a certain idea can propagate culture very quickly, whether or not it has been researched. It's sometimes irrelevant, and certain ideas propagate very quickly, and they can have a magnifying effect. And I was wondering if that's and I think you already addressed it. You think it's a straw manning of that argument, but I was just curious if there was.
Well, no, I do. Yeah. Now that you say that, I think there's a I do think there's a big problem of things being misrepresented and kind of extracted from their context. And I know, you know, increasingly now that I think legitimately are very concerned about it's just been total fabrications, right? Like with the kind of improved ability of like artificial intelligence or things to just sort of make something that's extremely realistic looking. But, you know, like probably now the technology exists to, you know, to put you or me in like a very realistic looking image that, you know, was quite compromising and obviously not like something that we actually did. So I think that there is a kind of, I mean, I guess media literacy is the term of just and this is, I think, what's the closest thing that I would feel comfortable calling like a mob mentality is when someone you know, like quote retweeting on Twitter is a good example of this, where you can sort of see something that someone said, and it's a thing that they actually said, right? Like you are using their actual words. So, I mean, obviously you could lie about this too, and people will have those like fake screenshots. It's not actually someone's tweet, but like you could even take a thing that a person actually said, or like an actual excerpt from something that they wrote, and then you take it out of its context and you insert your own commentary on it, and you essentially tell people what to think about it, or tell people what the context or what the meaning for it was. And many people are going, especially if you have a big platform or there are many people who view you as a credible source, people are going to accept what you said as correct. And truthfully, like my experience, even after the fact, if you show people the content, people are very reluctant to change their minds. Like once they've decided that X means Y, you can show them very like, no, that's literally not what happened. Yeah, and like they're still like, well, I don't know, I still don't like it. They're like they've made their emotional connection to it, and that's that. So I do think that like there's I mean, it's easy to say like, oh, we should just all be more media literate, but like I think it's another example where the technology really is kind of outstripping our capacity, and it's a big problem. And I think it helps to be aware of the problem. But like I've certainly fallen for things like that before myself, so it's not like I'm not claiming to be perfect in this regard either. I do think that you have to be extremely careful about who you choose to just like allow in front of your eyes in the first place, because there's so much stuff that happens even at kind of a subconscious level where, I mean, I think people have this idea, and I mean, this has been, it's like in the world of philosophy, I think it's been an outdated view of how human reasoning works for a very long time, but to have this idea of themselves as like rational agents where they just sort of evaluate the information. They're like, oh, I just look at an argument and I evaluate it for myself and I decide, is this argument or true or false? And it's just like, that's not how your brain works. It's not how reason. It's not that you are not an irrational person. No one does that. That's just not how we work. And you may occasionally. So essentially, my thing is like, if I catch somebody misrepresenting something, like there's someone that I follow a lot of people on Twitter and I unfollow a lot of people on Twitter, and I essentially had someone seems promising and I follow them for a little bit, and as soon as I catch that kind of disingenuousness or dishonesty or whatever, I see them misrepresent something, I'm pretty quick to unfollow or even block or mute them or whatever, because I'm not going to catch them every time. Like once they've demonstrated their willingness to do that, I'm not going to believe that I'll catch them every single time they do it. Like I know enough about certain, so like there's a few people, like Annie Duke, right, who has I would say like a deservedly very bad reputation in the poker community, has like outside of is selling herself, using her experiences in the poker world and presenting herself as like, oh, I learned all this stuff in poker and I can teach you these business skills as a result of my like brilliant poker experience. And like a lot of podcasts hosts or podcasts that I used to listen to have just sort of credulously brought her on their show and accepted at face value her story about like, oh, I was, they've apparently done no investigation into, or have not like fact checked her claims about what she was like in the poker world, or if they did, they chose not to engage with them. And like that dramatically lowers my opinion of any show. Like there's many shows that I've stopped listening to because they brought Annie Duke on. And that, I mean, I would say that's not me canceling them in the sense of like, I'm not, it's me losing trust in their filter. Like you have to rely on other people's value. I'm not going to be an expert on everything in the world. And so, I have to put limited trust in other people. And for me, at least, the way that I try to have like guardrails on that is, you don't get to fool me twice, or I do my best to like stop you from fooling me twice. So once you show me that you're not responsible with the platform that I've given you or the access that I've given you to my eyes and my thoughts, then I'm pretty quick to disengage.
Absolutely. I mean, you're casting your vote essentially. I mean, you're acting out your responsibility, and you can cast a negative vote in some sense. You say, you know what, this is not for me, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. Like, I mean, so that for the listener, which I think is very fair. I mean, it's if we don't react to the environment around us, then how will we create a mechanism where the higher quality things will raise to the top? So often by stop listening to some people, or by prioritizing, even better, by prioritizing our time, by spending our time to things which we value as higher quality, we can help promote better ideas. Of course, none of these mechanisms are perfect, but hopefully, we get to in the similar way that we get to better movies by voting better movies in our personal subjective opinions higher. That way we can hopefully help some of these good ideas rise to the top and worse ideas go to the bottom. Again, not a perfect mechanism, but incrementally, we can shift in that direction. Is that sort of like, or is it a caricature of your argument? I don't want to make it a caricature.
No, I think that's right, and I would say, I probably sold myself short a little bit, because I will try to bring it to the attention of those folks when I can and give them a chance to address it. So like this happened recently with a person. It was someone that I had actually started following because he is a little bit more right. He's about as right-leaning as I can tolerate. And so, he was someone that I was like, well, I'm trying to expose myself. So I also think this is important, that like when you're trying to expose yourself to I don't even want to say arguments that you disagree with, because ideally it's just more things I haven't thought of. Because like once I disagree with something, what that means to me is I've thought about it, I've decided it's wrong. I don't need to keep exposing myself to it again and again and again. So I'm more interested in exposing myself to like perspectives that I just haven't considered at all, that might not come into me from a different source. So he's an economist, person that I started following, or started listening to his podcast. There's a lot of interviews on there that I liked, that I thought were good, that I've benefited from hearing. And then he had Andy Duke on recently, and so I tweeted him and said, truthfully, I was probably not quite as compassionate in the tweet as I maybe could have been, but I was like, did you know about her history in the poker world? Like, if so, what was your thought process? And like bringing her on, I think this reflects very poorly on you. And he just blocked me. And so that was like the second thing. I was like, okay, it's one thing to make a mistake. Like I wouldn't say that like I feel pretty good about the guests I've had on the show, but like there's one or two that I might do differently if, in retrospect, like maybe I wouldn't have had them as guests on my show. So like, I understand that mistakes happen, and I know how difficult it is to get guests. And if someone has a really good publicist and eventually you're sort of like, I do need a guest this week. Okay, fine. Like I understand that these things happen, but like when someone brings to your attention, like, hey, you dropped the ball on this one, something slipped through, it's important to me. How do you handle that situation? Do you take responsibility for it? And do you say, oh, I guess I should have looked into that, or maybe I'm not looking into any of my guests enough, I should start put in place a more rigorous research process, or stop taking people at their word when they tell me that certain things are true? Because now I have to wonder, like, I know a lot about the poker space. So when a person comes up and says, hey, I was this super successful poker person, I'm like, no, actually, you were a disaster in the poker world. Like, I know that, but I don't know, how many Andy Dukes from other spheres have been sold to me that I didn't, recognize them for who they were.
No, that's right. And Peter.
Sorry, Don, it does bring up an interesting point about for people who have a significant audience, like the responsibility that they have to their listeners to, when they're putting forward either people or arguments or debate, that they're in some way balanced and not too subjective. I think like Matt Berkey was talking about this very eloquently in around the whole infamous Jack Forehand thing, and it's sort of his awareness around how much influence he actually has as a presenter, like his how much of an influence he is on his audience, and that trying to be understanding that has consequences, what he says and does in front of his viewers may have consequences for other people that he hadn't realized before, and just sort of understanding that he has more about his own responsibility now than he did previously.
Yeah, I've had some conversations with Matt specifically around this subject, and I should warn you, I'm going to have to go in about 5 minutes. But on the subject of kind of like one thing that he and I talked about is like, what does it mean to be authentic? Because I think there's some pushback from people who are kind of like, well, I can't even speak my mind anymore. Like I can't just say, I can't say what I think or say what I feel. And I think there's a difference between like, so much of like, we all put out so much content now, but not literally everyone, but like everyone on the show, and also Matt Berkey, we put out a lot of content, and like, we're not putting into it the kind of thought that went into, The Great Gatsby, right? Like it's sort of like great things that have been created, and like nothing that we think of as great, nothing that we would like point to as great was the result of someone just like firing off the first thoughts that came into their head. And in most cases, it was a matter of like they wrote it down and then they thought about it and they're like, do I really believe that? Is that actually what I want to say? Maybe it would be a little better if I said it this way. And they ran it past other people and those people gave them feedback and they were like, I don't know, I think it's a little tangential. Like, I think there's, a lot of that isn't happening with the content that's going out now. And the idea that like, as a result, like, because we're not going through those filters, like somehow the things that we're saying, like more authentically represent ourselves. Like, I don't think that's the case at all. Like I just there's that whole premise of sort of like being spontaneous is the same as being authentic, and I don't feel that way at all. In fact, I kind of I often, when I'm spontaneous, I often feel like later, oh, I could have said that better. I didn't really, like, I'm sure there's probably could be, if I won't for this reason, but like if I were to rewatch this, there would definitely be moments where I was like, oh, you could have worded that better. They could have found a better example for that. So there's a lot of things where I feel like because I was spontaneous, I was not as authentic as I could have been, and I didn't give the things that I wanted to say as much. I didn't cast them in as good of a light as I could have, and I think that happens quite a bit now with how much stuff just sort of gets, it's like we don't do drafts or anything on our podcast. It's just like one and done. We record it and out it goes. That's
yeah, very light editing. It's just literally, if there's a break or something, we'll edit that out. That's
yeah,
it.
It's like maybe like if there's like a scream in the background, we'll take that out. But
like for the record, Andrew, I feel exactly the same way, and I like I like to be spontaneous as well. But to your point, I feel exactly the same way as you just described. Right, the idea that if you prepare, it's easier to phrase specific arguments, and it's, to me at least, it's really painful to know that there is such a better way to express things. And I believe, Andrew, you and Nate, we were discussing this in the previous podcast, the idea of like the so-called rewrites. We're writing something and then we rewrite it, keep editing it until it becomes not perfect, but at least tolerable. So to the point that, we can let it off our hands. So yeah. I can definitely, we want to be respectful of your time, and we have a million of questions, which we're not going to get time to get to those. So here is what I'm proposing. I'm going to read some of these questions, and then you choose whichever one you feel you want to answer. How does that sound? Okay. So one question is debate league and how to make rational arguments. The other question is, what do you think about EA, which I'm assuming they're talking about effective altruism, specifically, how does it compare to more traditional philosophies like Christianity or Islam? We have another question about how you changed how you evolved your thinking about how to play poker and how to coach over the years. So we have a question about evolution of you as a player and as a coach. And another interesting question is, how do you know when a conversation is, legitimately, contentious but worthy of continuing, and when to jump ship? So we have a question about debate league and rational arguments, a question about effective altruism, your evolution as a poker player and as a coach, and how do you know when a discussion is worth continuing and when to jump ship?
Okay, so on the subject of a discussion worth continuing, I think most of these are going to require more than 2 minutes to give a good answer to. So I would be happy to do this again sometime soon, and
absolutely
we can address those in more detail. Now that that last one did kind of strike my fancy a little bit, so I'll try to give like a very quick answer to that, which is that I think the important thing to me is that I feel like I'm still being listened to in the discussion or debate or argument or whatever. Like, so once I feel like someone is no longer, I mean, whether it's literally they're not listening, like they're sort of talking over you or cutting you off or whatever, or they're just not processing what you're saying. Like they're just, if this happens in novice debates all the time, we've got 2 ships passing in a night, it's sort of like each team understands their own arguments, but they don't engage at all with what the other person said. They just keep getting up and re-explaining what they do. And that happens quite a bit, like on Twitter. And I think with my background in debate, I'm a lot better than the average person at kind of compelling that interaction, where when someone gives a response that doesn't, because part of the problem is, A says something, and then I'll say what I want to say, and then they'll say something new that's sort of like very provocative but doesn't address what I said. And so it's very tempting for me to then like jump on the shiny thing that they just brought up and be like, oh, but I have strong opinions on that too. So like keeping it focused, or kind of recognizing where the core of the disagreement is, that I think is like one of the biggest things that I got out of debate, is being able to prioritize, right? Because competitive debate takes place with time limits on your speeches. And in fact, part of the like the sort of technical side of debate that has nothing to do with like being good at arguing, like there are things that like if I were debating a team that were much worse than I was, one of the things I could probably do to win the debate that would have nothing to do with like the quality of my arguments is I could just put them in a position where they really struggled with time management and they just ran out of time to answer everything. I could just like talk faster than they do and like make a lot of arguments very efficiently, and they would just like not be able to answer them as efficiently as I made them. So there's a problem or whatever in debate, and asymmetry of someone can be very good at that technical skill, but when you get two teams who are kind of relatively equally good at that efficiency thing, then like the way you become more efficient than them is not like talking more quickly or using better word economy. It's recognizing which arguments are the kind of central ones where you're dedicating more of your time and your words to the things that matter most. And so being able to get, well, if I can prove this, then all the rest of that stuff kind of becomes irrelevant, like, so like being able to identify that kind of thing and boil the argument down to that. So I think that I'm like a good deal better than the average person at kind of pushing discussions in that direction. And so if people are willing to take that guidance, and like if they go off on tangents and they're willing to come back like, oh no, hold on, you didn't address this thing, which I think is really important. If they're willing to come back and do that, then I often consider that conversation worth continuing. I will say that that's like a good deal of work on my part, and often requires like they get upset and I have to stay calm during that. So like I do try to be limited where like I'll do that with certain people, but it kind of requires a lot of trust on my part to be willing to put forward that effort when I don't know that it's actually going to pan out. So like I'm most willing to do that with people who I already know, who have proven themselves in the past, or I have a relationship with them that they're like, I know that they're interested in maintaining that relationship. And so, they're going to feel a little more compelled to engage honestly in that way. And I'm pretty reluctant to do so with like random trolls on Twitter. I don't do that. I'm not like, okay, hold on, let's have a discussion about this thing that you did, it's maybe they would be perfectly fine interlocutors. Like I'm not necessarily assuming that they wouldn't be. I'm just saying I don't have the confidence that I would need in order to put forward the kind of effort that I just described.
No, this is very excellently put. And what you are describing, I sort of created a term for it. I call it the compatibility of disagreement. And essentially, if you can imagine the two opposing views as a branching tree, you start, one path goes to the left, the other path goes to the right. But if you think about it, if you reverse that tree backwards, there was a point. Even if you have to go really far back. I mean, if you go back to the first amoeba, so to speak, of the evolution, there was a common point at some point. You may have to go really far back, but and for me, like finding that common point, no matter how far back you have to go, right? To me, that's where it matters to can start understand the compatibility of disagreement. And it's beautiful that you put it, like the idea of like not addressing specific points, I think is very, very paramount to a conversation. And to me, it's a sign of good faith and interest in actually, is that a fair assessment? Sort of like finding.
No, I think that's a really nice analogy. That's kind of how I think about it as well.
Okay, great. Well, Andrew, we appreciate your time and coming up to showing up with us today and discussing. It goes without saying, you're welcome to do this with us at any point. We had a great time. And where can people find you?
Probably the number one place would be the Thinking Poker podcast, which you can find on whatever podcasting platform you listen to. That's where I would say I do my best work, and that's because I have my best coworker there in the form of co-host Carlos Welch, who you mentioned, and previously Nate Mavis, and the many guests such as yourself, Duncan, who have contributed as well. So I would say that's like the work that I'm most proud of. That and the books Play Optimal Poker and Play Optimal Poker 2. Those are the rare case work that I put out that was actually heavily revised and improved as a result of that revision process and the input of many other people. And then on Twitter at Thinking Poker, for as long as Twitter continues to be a platform worth using, which I'm a little more optimistic about than I was a few months ago, but we'll see. Yeah, those are the main spots.
Excellent. Well, you heard it here, folks. The podcast is Thinking Poker. The Twitter account has the same name at Thinking Poker. And of course, Play Optimal Poker 1 and 2. Really highly acclaimed book. I highly recommend it. Whatever your views are on GTO, this is a book worth reading, and the reason for that is because it goes down to the basic ideas behind it and why certain things work and others don't. So as someone who, you heard me, arguing in both, being very critical of the way people are approaching GTO in general, I have to say that this book is incredible, and I highly recommend it to anybody who is interested either in working with or without. It's and I don't know, Andrew, if you want to have any comments specifically on the book, because I really personally like it.
I appreciate your endorsement, but I should run. So
you got it, Andrew. All right. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, everybody, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah,
take care, guys.
See you everyone next week. Thanks again, Andrew.